From growing diplomatic tensions between India and Canada to a new push for peace in the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. Also, 6 months into the conflict, why are Sudan's warring generals resisting peace talks and insisting they will fight to the finish? And devastation in Derna. This week we asked if more could have been done to prevent the scale of destruction in Libya. I'm Hazem Sika, and this is the Newsmakers. Hardeep Singh Nijar was gunned down outside a Sikh cultural centre in the British Columbia city of Surrey in June. The Canadian citizen was a vocal supporter of a separate homeland for Sikhs in India. New Delhi had designated him a terrorist in 2020. Then on Monday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood up in Parliament and announced his security agencies had credible information linking Indian government agents to the killing. The allegation has triggered a tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats and derailed long-term trade talks. And now New Delhi has suspended visas for Canadians.
Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty. It is contrary to the fundamental rules by which free, open, and democratic societies conduct themselves. As you would expect, we've been working closely and coordinating with our allies on this very serious matter.
Such unsubstantiated allegations seek to shift the focus from Khalistani terrorists and extremists who have been provided shelter in Canada and continue to threaten India's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The Khalistan movement is banned in India. The government there sees it and affiliated groups as a national security threat. Indian authorities have cracked down on Sikh separatism over the years after an armed insurgency in Punjab state in the 1980s. Thousands of people were killed a few months after the operation. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards, triggering 4 days of rioting and communal violence. The movement still has some support in northern India, as well as in large diaspora communities in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. There are more than 770,000 Sikhs living in Canada.
We're thinking, our community thinking before, maybe India government involvement on that murder, but we not have any proof. But after Trudeau's statement, we thinking that's the relief for our community.
If somebody come here and start killing, so that's not a democratic country. That's what Sikh community believe.
Shamsher Singh is the co-founder of the National Sikh Youth Federation. He says more action needs to be taken.
This needs to manifest in action now. It's not enough just to directly accuse India. We've already seen the beginning of the action with the expulsion of Indian diplomats from Canada. But this needs to go much further, and there needs to be an end to intelligence sharing. There needs to be a recognition of India as a fascist, autocratic regime that will assassinate and target and kill political dissidents, not only within its own borders, but also abroad in other countries. And there also needs to be a shift in the understanding of the Khalistan movement. For too long has India got away with presenting Khalistan as an irrational, completely unfounded movement that is backed by its political opponents. And India categorically refuses to deal with Khalistan as a political conflict and instead resorts to assassinations, mass human rights violations, online censorship, grassroots censorship, imprisoning journalists, shutting down the internet, all means at its disposal. And now India has been exposed on the world stage for something that Sikhs have known for a very long time, that India will resort to violence in order to silence any dissent.
Raman Malik, India is a fascist state.
We take care of our interests, and if some terrorist tries to attack, when the Khalistan movement, so as to speak, has been orchestrated by the ISI of Pakistan, and these people who demand Khalistan do not understand that most of the Punjab, which was there by the Gurus, which was inhabited, which was blessed by the Gurus, was in now what is the Pakistani Punjab. Now, one has to realize that the entire Palestini movement is against the tenets of the Sikhi, which we cannot discuss at length here because the time is too small. But let's understand something basic. When you come, if a state comes and hits us, if people who are against the sovereignty, integrity of India, they work against us, we have the ways and means. We did Balakot and we showed the world that yes, we can hit when we want, where we want, and however we want. But with Canada, it is a very simple thing that we have friendly relation and we expect Canada to walk the talk in respecting our integrity as we respect its integrity. Otherwise, we could also be, helping the people in Quebec to, the way they want a separate state. But we are not doing that.
Indiscriminate airstrikes and shelling are not new in Sudan's civil war. But in recent weeks, residents of the greater Khartoum area say their city has been reduced to a battlefield. Earlier this month, dozens were killed in a drone attack on an open-air market, and a landmark building was engulfed by fire. After escaping a siege in the capital, the head of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, pledged a decisive victory instead of heading to peace talks in Saudi Arabia. His rival, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti, says the RSF will fight to the finish. So why have the warring generals seemingly hardened in their positions against each other? And what will it take to end a conflict that has already killed 5,000 people and displaced more than 7 million?
The UN says Sudan has become the world's most dangerous and complex environment to deliver aid after almost 6 months of conflict. Witnesses say last weekend saw the most violent battles in the capital Khartoum since the war began. Key institutions were targeted, including the Justice Ministry. An iconic tower was also engulfed in fire, with the warring sides trading blame for the attacks. Simmering tensions between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces plunged into full-scale fighting in April. Thousands of people have been killed and ethnically motivated attacks have ramped up in West Darfur. Reports suggest there are at least 13 mass graves around the restive region's capital, El Janina. Human rights groups have accused both sides of committing war crimes.
Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including health facilities, places of worship, water and electricity installations have been targeted, damaged, and destroyed. There have been shocking accounts of widespread rape and sexual violence. There must be accountability for these crimes, as well as medical and psychosocial support for survivors.
The conflict has displaced 7.1 million people, including 1 million who have fled to the neighboring countries. Aid organizations are struggling to cope with the sheer number of refugees due to insufficient funds. The UN says that the fighting has brought healthcare in the country to its knees, leaving many vulnerable to epidemic disease. In the last 4 months, refugee agencies have reported more than 3,000 suspected measles and 500 cholera cases, along with outbreaks of dengue fever and malaria. More than 1,200 refugee children under the age of 5 have died from disease and malnutrition.
UNICEF fears that many thousands of newborns will die between now and the end of the year. 330,000 children will be born in Sudan between October and December. They and their mothers, as you heard, do need skilled delivery care, rather in a country where millions are trapped, millions are lacking access to those basic healthcare services, and there are of course grave shortages of medical supplies. Such care is becoming less and less likely by the day.
In August, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan moved his operations to Port Sudan after being trapped in army headquarters in Khartoum for months. The city has the country's only functioning airport and hosts UN missions. Burhan has also made several foreign trips to drum up diplomatic support. In the past few weeks, he has visited several countries including Egypt, Qatar, and Eritrea. And on Wednesday, he touched down in New York to address the UN General Assembly.
We in the armed forces reassure the Sudanese people and the whole world that we are continuing on the path to complete what we started earlier in this transitional phase, to defeat the rebellion and to move forward with our previous commitments of transitioning to a democratic rule.
RSF leader Muhammad Hamadan Dagolo says he will start consultations to form local authorities in areas under his control, a move that could result in rival governments.
Our priority must be to end the war and to unite Sudan. We must not allow the formation of a war government in Port Sudan. Establishing such a government means that we are heading to scenarios that happened in other countries, where two parties control different areas in one country.
While the scale of human suffering and destruction increases, no side seems closer to a victory in a conflict that is destabilizing the entire region.
Amgad Farid Tayeb is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and the Executive Director of Fikra for Studies and Development, a public policy think tank. He told me what needs to be done to end the conflict.
Any solution should be very clear that it cannot be built over what happened in the past. Those who participated in making this war cannot be rewarded for their bad deeds. Any solution needs to take any solutions that can take place need to have the elements of reforming the army and depoliticizing it, and in the same time dismantling the militia, the RSF, completely, and ending its institutional existence. And by ending its institutional existence, I'm not only talking about its military presence and its forces, but also the RSF, it's engulfing a huge economic and politically corrupt empire. This also needs to be disbanded for any solutions that can maintain stability and peace and return to democracy in Sudan.
David, what does a lasting end to the fighting there look like to you?
Well, I think there are two stages to this. The first stage is to stop the bleeding, and that would entail making sure that we can have both General Al-Bohan of the Sudanese Armed Forces and General Hemeti to reconcile and go back to what appeared to be some level of coordination and collaboration between the two forces. That will stop the fighting, which is very important. And I think the next stage would be to arrive at an architecture that would provide for a democratic process to return to Sudan. And then, of course, we can talk about a unified army, which, of course, it's the main cause of this crisis. But it has to be within that stage, within those stages, for us to get to any point whereby anything that looks like a solution could be seen on the horizon.
Experts say a mix of crumbling infrastructure, corruption, and the accelerating climate crisis worsened flooding in the Libyan city of Derna. On Monday, more than a week after the disaster, demonstrators gathered outside Derna's Grand Mosque, accusing officials of neglect. And there have been reports authorities in the eastern Libyan city had asked journalists to leave to allow for smoother rescue operations. So will anyone be held to account for the scale of death and destruction in Derna? And can Libya's rival governments put aside their differences for rescue and reconstruction efforts? Take a look.
Volunteers, food parcels and clothes have poured into flood-stricken Derna. All have come from across Libya. Despite years of conflict between the country's bitterly divided leaders.
This catastrophe proved that Libyans are united. Even those who have opposing political stance and views, or have different external or internal interests, were united after what happened in the east. In Derna, Al-Baida, Susha and Shahat, it proved that Libyans are united.
Thousands of people were killed in Derna last Sunday when a tsunami-like wall of water washed away whole districts after two dams collapsed under storm floods. More than a week on, the death toll is still rising. The staggering scale of devastation has some asking if the disaster could have been avoided. UN experts have blamed climate factors and the legacy of Libya's war, depleting infrastructure, early warning systems, and emergency response.
This is a tragedy in which climate and capacity has collided to cause this terrible, terrible tragedy. Derna, a city of, whatever, 100,000 people, 900,000 people affected, and this is on top of a situation in Libya where 300,000 people in Libya already needed humanitarian aid.
The dams that burst were built in the mid-70s to protect the 100,000 population of Derna after it was hit by flooding in the mid-20th century. Cracks in the walls were first reported in 1998, and the banks of a dry riverbed or wadi running through the city center had been heavily built on. That riverbed would become an epicenter of Derna's destruction. Libya's Prosecutor General says it will investigate the collapse of the dams as well as the allocation of maintenance funds.
The investigation includes the maintenance funds that were paid to maintain the two dams and to minimize the effects of their damage resulting from floods and heavy rainfall. This investigation is underway in the Public Prosecutor's Office. What we can say now is that the investigation will include local authorities as well as consecutive governments for negligence.
And despite Libyans coming together to help, observers are watching to see if Libya's rival governments can coordinate relief efforts. Derna is in eastern Libya, controlled by Khalifa Haftar, who mounted a 14-month campaign to capture the capital Tripoli from the UN-backed central government in 2019. Despite a 2020 ceasefire that ended most major warfare, a political gridlock has gripped Libya for more than a year, making national elections impossible. Since the Derna disaster, the rival administrations have tentatively coordinated on some issues, and foreign governments suspicious of Haftar and Libyan corruption have sent aid and volunteers. But analysts stress the shared national grief over Derna won't lead to a diplomatic breakthrough, and warn that political leaders could position themselves to benefit from any long-term development funds.
So what more can be done for Derna? Well, Salahuddin Abulgasim is the Deputy Director of Partner Development at Islamic Relief UK. He explained what's needed on the ground.
We need to allow the agencies to have access. We need to allow those with the speciality and with know-how in order to coordinate, in order to work in such difficult contexts. We need to ensure that relief aid is given to the people. We need to ensure that people are not left hungry, people are not left homeless. We also need to be committed to understand that, yes, there is current media attention and interest in it, but Libya is a fragile state. There are so many things at play. We need to understand that context, and we also need to appreciate this is a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution. And from a pure humanitarian perspective, we need to understand that, the human impact. We're hearing, and I'm hearing directly from our colleagues on the ground, of the psychological and emotional impact that this is, going to be having in the long term. There's a generation of children who've just witnessed what they're referring to in Arabic it's like Yom al-Qiyamah, like the Day of Judgment, like Doomsday thing, scenes, horrific scenes, families, full blocks where maybe I know a friend who lost 60 family members. You can't recover from this, and we're never going to be able to recover from this. But we need to understand that in the long term, how do we try to not only rebuild, go through a process of accountability, rebuild structures, rebuild homes, but also try and at least rebuild people's lives, people's livelihoods, people's emotions, people's psychological pain and suffering. And also we need to put in place measures to ensure something like this tragedy never happens again. And appeal to the international community to intervene now, to ensure that we're committed in the long term to putting the measures in place to avoid such issues happening again.
Well, you bring up a good point there about the international community, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to ask Anas Gomati this question, and I don't mean to diminish or oversimplify the divisions in Libya right now between the political factions and the governments there. But in the short term, can this be seen as a wake-up call for those political factions, that they have to come together now to address the deep problems there right now?
No, I think within that actually is the illusion that it's somehow their disunity that needs to be resolved they're unified in blocking elections, and they have been unified in blocking elections for the last decade. This isn't the time for Libyans to be calling kumbaya. They have never been divided. It's their political leadership that created this illusion of this unity. And they're using it now as a smokescreen to kind of suffocate the voices that are calling for accountability, and they're calling for a full investigation by local and international authorities, because we should be quite clear here. You know, a rainfall warning is not the same as a dam burst warning. And when they locked those people into their homes in the hours that mattered on September the 10th, they essentially locked them into their homes, and it was a death sentence. They could have evacuated those citizens, they could have gotten them out. And right now, the sentence has been extended because they have been in charge of the logistical response for what has been happening over the last week. And when minutes matter in a humanitarian operation like this, they forced the landing of international aid and international rescue teams to Benghazi, the nerve center of their operations, 6.5 hours drive from Derna, when they could have been landing in Labrak an hour and 15 minutes away from this. So it's not just oversight, it's misdirection. They're trying to make sure that the voices in Benghazi and the voices in Derna are being shuttled away. We've heard about dissenting voices that have been silenced in the last few days. So much of what happened in the run-up to this catastrophe is so much about what Salah ad-Din and your other guests have been mentioning around the tragic kind of governance crisis that Libya has been enduring for the last decade, none of which are of a Libyan making, by the way. This is of the making of the international community because they appointed them.
The Oslo Accords were seen as a major breakthrough in Palestine-Israel relations back in 1993. A final treaty was meant to be agreed in 5 years, but 30 years on, the interim Palestinian Authority remains in place. Illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank have increased more than 7-fold, and Israel has elected its most far-right government. The first Oslo Accord was signed on the White House lawn and was followed by a historic handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat. The agreement was the first ever direct deal between Israelis and Palestinians. It set out a plan for future peace talks with the goal of a two-state solution. The leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization returned from exile and were recognized by Israel as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO, in turn, recognized Israel's right to exist in peace.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
أتوجه إلى شعب إسرائيل.
Let me address the people of Israel and their leaders, with whom we are meeting today for the first time. And let me assure them that the difficult decision we reached together was one that required great and exceptional courage. We will need more courage and determination to continue the course of building coexistence and peace between us.
Over the last few years, a number of Arab countries have started normalizing ties with Israel as part of a US-led deal called the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia is also in talks with Tel Aviv, with Riyadh insisting that Palestinian statehood is at the heart of their negotiating strategy. And Saudi Arabia hosted the Peace Day effort for Middle East Peace Initiative on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York this past week. Hugh Lovett is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He says the international community has a role to play in preparing for peace talks.
When we're talking about mediating Israeli-Palestinian peace, we are so far away from any potentially meaningful and serious peace process. So talking about who can do it or who's an honest broker, I think is almost academic. The priority is how does one recreate the foundations that can allow for a relaunch of serious and meaningful peace negotiations in the future, whether that is towards a two-state solution or some other dispensation that can guarantee equal rights. Clearly, there's a conversation and there's actions that need to be taken vis-a-vis Israel in terms of challenging Israeli impunity and changing Israeli public and political support, moving that away from continued occupation towards deoccupation. But likewise, there's a question about what could Europe do to try to re-legitimize, reform, and revive Palestinian institutions, which would be a way to also enhance Palestinian agency. And I think then the question is, not just what Europe can do, and I think it has a lot, and we can go into that, but also why should Europe be doing this? As I said, it's a core funder, so in some ways it is implicated in what's happening. But ultimately, I think having a legitimate, strong, and representative Palestinian leadership that represents Palestinian aspirations, that can push forward Palestinian unification and reconciliation, and that can offer perhaps a more viable strategy in support of Palestinian rights. Ultimately, that's something that's good for Palestinians, but that's also something that's good for the EU and the European Union and its member states, because that is ultimately, I think, the only way we're going to start to make serious progress towards challenging Israel's open-ended occupation.
Thanks for watching. Remember, you can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.